Well, there's more than a Chinese virus pandemic sweeping through America, ladies and gentlemen. There's also a pandemic ever-growing of sentimentality, emotionalism, silliness, and general tomfoolery. We discussed this just a few weeks ago, maybe last week, was it, when we talked about our friend Brian Selter sobbing and going home and crying because he couldn't handle the news. Hi, everybody. I'm Bill Whittle here with Steve Green and Scott Otta, and we have another milestone on the slow descent to hell. We now have a situation where we're not only talking about the lowering of standards in schools and lowering the bar in schools. We know that conservatives have been homeschooling for quite a long time because of the falling standards and the indoctrination in schools. But today, I heard a term that I had never heard before, courtesy of Alanis Morissette, who you may remember from the 90s with her album Jagged Little Pill and her song You Oughta Know, which basically gave every single heterosexual male in the country the sensation of a bullet whizzing past your ear, like, God, I could have almost dated that person. Dear God, I was lucky. In any event, Alanis Morissette is happy to tell us all about what she's doing with her children, which she keeps at home. She doesn't homeschool them. She unschools them. That's the term she uses, unschooling. Because you see, according to our friend Rousseau, children are born with perfect knowledge and perfect virtue as well, by the way, and that life simply corrupts them. And so Miss Morissette apparently has a long article about how to unschool your children and basically how to uneducate them. And I think this is kind of a first. I'm not so much interested in what Alanis Morissette has to say about schooling her children, but I am a little worried about how all of this stuff actually comes about. So let's just look a little bit into the article here. Why don't we? First of all, the children, their names are here somewhere. You should
Let's not drag them into this.
You're right. You're right. You're absolutely right, Scott. Let's not drag them into this. In any event, what Alanis Morissette is basically promoting for all Americans is the idea that you should take your children at home and then see what they're interested in and then do that until they change and decide to do something else. She says, I watch their eyes, and whatever they're looking at, I drill deep into that. She said, here's how she defined unschooling. She said, quote, "It is child-led education," unquote, adding, quote, "If there's some agenda like let's play with these magnet tiles and my daughter is like, F those magnet tiles, I want to put glitter on that thing and cut the tree and put the thing, boom, we do that." Okay, if your 2 or 3 year old daughter should say, F those magnet tiles, then F the magnet tiles and we go on and put glitter on the tree. The reason why this is so disturbing, folks, it should be obvious to anybody who has any sense of education or what education actually is. Steve, let's start with you. You've got a couple kids.
I do.
First of all, I'll ask you a two-part question. I'll ask them separately. First of all, was it your experience as an adult growing up that your children were perfect fonts of virtue that basically educated you in the right thing to do? Or did it turn out that maybe they were not quite so morally advanced as the left seems to think that children really are?
Children are little barbarians.
They are. They're little lying thieves.
They're just awful. And keep in mind, my boys are 14 and 9. I could not be more proud of them. In fact, my 9-year-old is verging on 10. I can't believe he's hitting double digits, which is adding more gray to the already generous selection on my head. A little more every single day. And then I got to think about things like that. It's a lot more every single day. Anyway, they are not born with any knowledge. And as soon as they figure out that they can get things, they start figuring out the worst possible ways to get things. And you've got to instill morality into them because they don't have any. They're not born with any. They are little barbarians. The thing you might have the biggest problem is just especially when they're little, before you've had a chance for their lessons to really sink in, is the bald-faced lies they will tell you to try and get what they want. And if you don't have discipline and authority, which are the two things Alanis Morissette threw right out the door at the outset, then you've got nothing. You are never going to civilize these little tiny barbarians into grown adults that you can be proud of. I did a little research on Rousseau. I hadn't read them, I don't think, since maybe I was a freshman or a sophomore in college. And I wanted to refresh my memory here. And so I pulled up his Wikipedia entry. And I know Wikipedia is not the greatest source in the world, but for kind of the general things, was born on such and such a day, it's usually pretty good. And you know what I don't see here as I'm scrolling through his Wikipedia profile? Children. I'm not seeing anything here about children, or if he did have children, if they actually grew up to become anything of any kind of note whatsoever. And I'm not coming up with anything here. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the leaders of the French Revolution at some point adopted some of his ideas and went with that. So who knows? All I can say is, Alanis, I wish you the very best of luck, because as those kids get older and bigger and are running roughshod over you, you're going to need it.
So let me ask you a follow-up here, Steve. When your children make it clear that there's something that they want, you give it to them every time, right?
No. What are you going to do to earn it?
Why do you hate your children so?
What are you going to do to earn it?
Don't you love your kids? Why don't you give them what they want all the time?
Because I love them. I'm not always going to be here. I am not always going to be here. And if those little barbarians don't get some civilization into them, they're not going to be able to handle it once I'm gone. They're going to expect that they can make demands and the universe will supply.
Do you ever ask them to do tasks?
No, I tell them.
Okay, well said. When you tell them to do a task, if they lose interest in the task and their eyes start to drift, do you say, well, obviously we should be concentrating more on what they want to do?
Yeah, how do we make taking out the trash more fun?
You make your children take out the trash?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well,
Why do you hate your children so?
Still not quite. This is something I tell my boys quite often. And it seems to be sinking in. You have to repeat yourself a lot as a parent. It's just part of what you sign up for. But I keep asking them to take note of the fact that nobody tells mom or dad when to do our various chores around the house or anything like that. And yet the house is in a pretty decent state of repair. The laundry gets done and all the rest. And that nobody has to tell us to do these things. And the reason nobody has to tell us to do these things is because when we were children, people told us again and again and again to do these things until it became a part of our civilized culture rather than our barbarian lying and grasping to get out of things or to get what we want by means foul.
Scott, let's talk about the education aspect and the attention span aspect. When you're trying to impart something to your kids, perhaps it's a biblical verse or some piece of knowledge you think is worthwhile, and you see their eyes glaze over. If you loved your children, needless to say, you would stop at that point and determine what it is they're looking at and then talk about that. But I suspect you don't. You have the cruelty of a conservative in your eyes that lets me ascertain that you probably would continue to force them to listen to something that they didn't want to listen to. Is that a fair assessment?
I think the toughest thing to do as a parent is to keep the end in mind while you're mucking through the challenge of it all. And I will openly confess that I have often failed to keep the end in mind and kind of got upset or frustrated or, lost my focus because the child was being, as Steve described, the way children are. It's so precious to hear a grown-up express this view of childhood and how I wish children were like that. I can't tell you how many adults have labored as hard as possible to prevent their kids' first word from being no. And nevertheless, that's what they got. From the very moment that a child can express rebellion, he does. And that's just part of human nature. So this whole unschooling idea is not completely without merit, because my grandparents would find ways, when I was brought up by my grandparents, and they would find ways to tap into my natural curiosity or my momentary curiosity of something in order to build in some lesson, whether that be a knowledge lesson or a character lesson or a moral lesson. But they would follow where I was going and then fill in the gaps because I didn't know where I was going. But they didn't always follow where I was going. They often led me to where they were going, because there are places that she, the child, needs to go that she doesn't know yet. She doesn't know she needs to go there. And your responsibility as an adult, because you've already been there, is to lead her in the way. I mean, nowhere else in the animal kingdom do we see this notion to say, well, the mama duck says to the daddy duck, hey, if the duckling just wanders off out into the lake, I think we should just let her go. Don't worry about that gar that may come leaping out of the water and eat her. Don't worry about the crow that may come down on the shore and pick her up. You are responsible as an adult to lead that child. There's a passage in Scripture that says, train a child up in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, when he is young, he will often depart from it. And like Steve said, you need to repeatedly bring him back onto the path. I learned mathematics on my grandmother's knee, or rather on the oaken bench that was on our dining room table, because we were sitting there with graph paper and writing out the times tables. Did I want to do that? No. Do I see value in it now? Yes. Did I see value in it then? Yeah. But still, it seemed like a lot of effort to get the value. In hindsight now, I think, well, thank goodness, because that stuff's just in my head now, and I don't have to think about it when the time comes to calculate a tip, for example, or do some other function in public. I think that Alanis means well, and so many parents like her mean well, because they have this perception of teaching or schooling as being, some Pink Floydian schoolmaster who's against which we would rise up and shout, "We don't need no education." But really, a good teacher—
We don't need any education.
That's right. We requireth not an education. But a good teacher uses a combination of both guidance in advance, saying, here's where we're going, and as well as following along with the students and saying, oh, you're interested in birds? Let me show you something about birds. You got in that fight with Billy? Let me teach you a little bit about character and human development and how to settle disputes and things like that. And so, good leadership, good parenting, good teaching is about both following the inclinations of the child and then also leading the child in places that she does not know yet that she needs to go.
The first thing that comes to mind when I think about this is something that somebody pointed out about Bill Gates's house. There's a story, I don't know if it's true, but it made the rounds, that Bill Gates basically had a house where he had electronic pictures on the wall. They weren't prints, they were electronic pictures. And the house would recognize you, and it would know what your tastes were. And then everywhere you would go, it would present you with the kind of things that you've either expressed an interest in before, that it was able to do that you already liked. And so therefore, no matter where you go, you would be surrounded by art that was appealing to you. And the problem with this idea is, how do you know what kind of art is going to be appealing to you until you see something different? The idea that we're going to limit our children's education to the things that they find interesting now is to suggest that they have, at the ages of 2 or 3 or 4, a complete knowledge of the world. They don't know enough about the world to be curious about things that they don't know about. The entire process of education is to force children to understand that there are things out there, and it is not pleasant sometimes to have to focus on these things and learn them, but that opens up entire possibilities of curiosity that they can use later. When it comes down to this, it's like, well, at least my kids are happy. And I gave this serious thought. I look back on my childhood, those parts of it that I can remember, and I remember 2 clear moments of just radiant joy. One of them was when I hit a triple in Little League Baseball. I was not a long ball hitter. I was probably the worst player on the team. Nevertheless, I did hit a triple, and I remember being on third base, and that memory is as fresh to me as it is today. Secondly, I had an extreme great good fortune having gone to British schools growing up. And as a result of that, we were taking chemistry in second and third grade. And in chemistry class, we came into class one day and the teacher, the chemistry master, as we came in, had a flask that was underneath the Bunsen burner and it was bubbling. And we all came in and sat down and the teacher said, how do we know that these bubbles are the result of heat or whether they're the result of a chemical action? How could we test this? And everybody was thinking it over and there was silence in the room. And I put my hand up and I said, we could turn off the burner. And he said, yes. And I felt like the king of the world. I felt like the king of the world because I had reasoned something and had figured out the power of logic and how that applies to everything else. All of these things are difficult. All of them require effort. Letting your kids teach themselves requires no effort whatsoever. And it is a dereliction of duty is what it is. It's just plain child abuse. It is not fair to them. Your job is not to determine what they are interested in right now and do what they're interested in right now. Your job is to expose them to as many things as possible so that they will become as interested in as many things as they possibly can be. And if you do this right, the time will come for them when they will begin to realize that things that you didn't realize were connected or actually are connected, that there is a connection between things, that the word sheriff and shire come from the same thing. The sheriff is the guy who was administering the shire. I remember thinking, so the Old West sheriff is the same as the guy from Robin Hood? Yes. Well, hot damn, isn't that an interesting thing to know? And on and on and on. And the more you expose people to this, the more the connections grow. People like Alanis Morissette are taking the easy way out because, and more than that, they're signaling it as a virtue. And that's the part I have the problem with. It is commonly said today about education, and you hear this from people who are students today, who when you ask them about, you guys don't know, you have no idea about history or geography. You can't find the United States on a globe of the earth. You don't know who fought in World War II. The response will inevitably be, if I need to know that, I can simply Google it. And folks, I've said it before, but it needs to be said apparently frequently. The problem with young people today in the education system today is not that they don't know the answers. The problem is they don't know the questions. They don't know what questions to ask. They've never been given an internal framework of things through study and hard work that allows them to put together two different things that then create the question that then they can go out and look for the answer for. It's not that they don't know the answers. It's that they don't know what questions to ask. And that is a catastrophe. And it's child abuse. And it is not kindness, and it is not modern, and it is not love. It is laziness and narcissism to allow children to educate themselves and to think that the entire idea of school and education is something that needs to be undone is just plain savage, is what it is. It's a savage, tribal, primitive way of thinking about things, and it's obvious to everyone. Absolutely obvious to everyone. I'm sorry to have to signal you out there, Miss Morissette, but you're the one who was on the magazine cover talking about this and not me, so there you go. Education is hard, and the more of it you do, the easier it gets. The less of it you do, the harder it gets. And I genuinely feel sorry for these kids. I hope they actually have a chance to go to a real school someplace and undo the damage that's being done by having been unschooled by a celebrity mom. And this final lesson in all of this is we should never, ever, 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 ever listen to anything that actors, musicians, or any other forms of performers should ever give us advice on, ever. It's not real. And the world is. So there you go. Next time a pandemic comes up in 20 years, you'll know that viruses are little tiny little green monster men that chew up things, and that's not going to help us when it comes time for finding new antivirals. For Steve Green and Scott Ott, I'm Bill Whittle. Thanks very much for joining us. Messages like this, old-fashioned, old-timey messages, with a ruler and a good smack on the knuckles, are brought to you by the paying members at BillWhittle.com. And if you're one of those old fogey stick in the mud type folks, we'd love to have you join us. You'll feel right at home here among those of us cruel enough to face reality in the eyes and govern our lives accordingly. We'll see you next week right here on Right Angle.